Two of the most powerful names in the Black Church, Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Paul Morton, are no longer just leaders on the pulpit. They're now at the center of a storm that no one saw coming. What began as quiet whispers in private meetings has exploded into public controversy, sending shockwaves across congregations, church networks, and the entire faith community. Pastors are talking, members are divided, and critics are asking, is this just a misunderstanding or the beginning of something much bigger? Stay with me, because what we uncovered about this brewing conflict will leave you stunned, and it could change the way the church world looks at its most respected leaders forever. Did Bishop T.D. Jakes really confront Bishop Paul Morton? And if so, what could possibly spark a clash between two of the most powerful men in modern ministry? Stay with me, because the details of this confrontation are more shocking than anyone expected, and the truth may not be what you think. When you hear the names Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Paul Morton, you don't just think of preachers. You think of giants of faith, men whose voices shaped a generation, men who built movements, carried authority, and commanded influence far beyond the church walls. Bishop Jakes, the visionary force behind the Potter's House in Dallas, has built one of the largest, most influential ministries in the entire world. Bishop Paul Morton, the trailblazer who founded the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, transformed how thousands of churches worship and operate. Together, these men stand as living legends. But what happens when legends collide? What happens when long-simmering differences can no longer be hidden behind smiles, handshakes, and public appearances? That's exactly the storm shaking the church world right now. And the revelations we're about to uncover could send shockwaves across pulpits and pews nationwide. Additionally, the repercussions is leading some to wonder about the future of the Black church as a whole, as well as the relationship between these two leaders. You see, there have been rumors, little conflicts, silent disputes, and divergent ideas about the future of the church for years. According to sources, Jake and Morton have never been adversaries, but they've also never agreed on anything. Furthermore, other stories claim that Bishop Jake has now directly faced Bishop Morton. Why now, one could ask? What might have happened to T.D. Jake, a man renowned for his tact, intelligence, and diplomacy, to come up and boldly confront Paul Morton? Was doctrine at issue? Did power have a role? Or was it something far more intimate? Today's video will explain the specifics of what transpired between Bishop Paul Morton and Jakes. We'll examine their relationship's history, the causes of their arguments, and the startling specifics of this altercation that have astonished congregations nationwide. And I promise you that what we're about to unveil could permanently alter your perception of these leaders, so you'll want to stay until the very end. This isn't just church gossip, so take a seat. This is about legacy, influence, and a conflict that has the potential to change the course of two influential ministries. It only gets more intense from here. I promise. We must first examine the lengthy history between Bishop T.D. Jake and Bishop Paul Morton in order to comprehend their dispute. A history of respect for one another, sporadic arguments, and a common impact on millions of people. Bishop T.D. Jakes gained widespread recognition in the 1990s thanks to his influential sermons and best-selling books. With tens of thousands of members, millions of online viewers, and a reputation for quality around the world, his ministry, the Potter's House in Dallas, has grown into a major global institution. Jake is not merely a pastor. He is a cultural icon who bridges the divide between entertainment, the church, and even corporate leadership. He has given celebrity advice, hosted presidents, and developed a brand that is as much about gospel as it is about empowerment. Bishop Paul Morton, however, is a renowned figure in his own right. In the 1990s, he rose to prominence as the head of the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, a movement that broke with established Baptist institutions. Morton had three goals in mind: embracing the gifts of the Spirit, bringing Pentecostal fire into Baptist congregations, and developing a fresh, free, and structured form of worship. That movement changed worship as we know it today and impacted thousands of congregations, both inside and outside of the United States. This is when the exciting part begins. Morton and Jake frequently crossed paths as they were establishing their empires. They shared pulpits, spoke at the same conferences, and were frequently perceived as belonging to the same group of Black church leaders. Beneath the surface, however, their methods differed slightly. Crossing cultural boundaries, branding, and growth have always been important to Jake. He has collaborated with Hollywood producers, given speeches in arenas, and established himself as a leader who could motivate people outside of the church. Morton was just as ambitious, but he remained more concerned with denominational leadership and church reform, frequently emphasizing spiritual accountability and upholding a distinct line between the sacred and the profane. People started to notice these disparities over time. According to certain rumors, Morton thought Jake was becoming overly Hollywood and preoccupied with his image and power. According to others, Jake thought Morton was too conservative and hesitant to change with the times. These underlying differences produced a subtle tension that, according to insiders, never really went away, even though neither man publicly attacked the other. However, there was also a great deal of respect. Both men were always friendly in public and respected each other's achievements. Morton's efforts in extending the role of the Spirit in Baptist churches was once commended by Jake. Morton, however, recognized Jake's capacity to touch hearts that many pastors were unable to. However, as is the case with many influential people, rivalry is not always eliminated by respect. These little tensions increased over time. Both Jake and Morton found themselves making decisions that further emphasized their differences as the church world evolved due to social media crises and changing societal expectations. Morton's supporters believed he stood for honesty, custom, and stability. Jake's supporters praised his creativity, audacity, and capacity to maintain the church's relevance in a rapidly changing world. Therefore, it wasn't shocking to learn that Bishop Jake had challenged Bishop Morton directly. It was the culmination of decades of disagreements and the clash of two opposing ideas about what the Black church ought to be. Even though nobody anticipated a public confrontation between these two titans, perhaps it was inevitable in retrospect. Here's the startling bit though. The dispute went beyond leadership philosophies. It was triggered by something much more profound, something personal that compelled Jake to speak up in a manner he had never done before, according to others with knowledge of the matter. After establishing the fundamentals of these two titans, let's discuss the real reason why Bishop T.D. Jakes confronted Bishop Paul Morton. Because Jake isn't renowned for getting into arguments in public. He uses words carefully, diplomatically, and strategically. Something important had to force him to come forward and speak to Morton directly. Insiders connected to both sides claim that the altercation wasn't an unexpected eruption. It was the outcome of a gradual accumulation. Years of little arguments, nuanced critiques, and divergent ideas about the church world coming together at the wrong time. Paul Morton's alleged remarks regarding the course of the modern church served as one of the initial catalysts. According to Morton, who is renowned for taking strong positions, today's mega ministries were straying too far into the entertainment industry. He discussed how pastors are putting media attention, marketing deals, and celebrity appearances ahead of biblical accountability. Even though he didn't specifically name Jake, many others made the connection. After all, Jake has collaborated with Hollywood studios, Tyler Perry, and Oprah. For many who supported Morton, those remarks were a wake-up call. However, it sounded like a covert jab at their commander to Jake's camp. However, there were other points of tension as well. The topics of influence, leadership, and succession arose again. Bishop Morton publicly discussed the perils of constructing ministries on a single man's personality before to resigning as the leader of full gospel. He emphasized the significance of developing leaders who share authority and making sure that ministries wouldn't disintegrate in the absence of their founder. In contrast, Bishop Jake, whose ministry is closely linked to his personal brand, continues to be the focal point of the Potter's house. Once more, Morton didn't say anything specifically about Jake, but the suggestion was obvious enough to spark discussion. Then there was the matter of public witness and social justice. Jake has established himself as a voice on national platforms in recent years, giving speeches on economic empowerment, engaging with legislators, and creating a stir in areas where many traditional pastors haven't visited. Morton, however, has placed less emphasis on the political limelight and more on the church's place in the community. There was a subtle but noticeable friction between the two leaders' followers as a result of their different approaches. What, then, was the tipping point? According to reports, it was a private meeting of prominent church leaders where intense discussions took place. Morton said things that many saw as a direct attack on pastors who cared more about their celebrity status than their role as shepherds. Bishop Jake, who had previously said nothing in response to numerous such remarks, decided that enough was enough at that point. According to reports, he refused to back down and spoke with Morton directly, defending not only his ministry but also the notion that the church may be both spiritually and culturally relevant. The room was described as tense by witnesses. It was more than just a disagreement between two pastors. This was a line drawn in the sand by two tall, religious men. Morton is reported to have strengthened his conviction that fame and wealth are threatening to rob the modern church of its essence. According to reports, Jake retorted that reaching the world occasionally necessitates leaving the church's confines and that relevance is not compromise. That altercation caused repercussions long after the meeting. Word got out. The intimate altercation abruptly became a public spectacle as whispers became headlines. Pastors, churchgoers, and even famous people who support both guys started to comment. Was Morton correct to point out what he perceived as harmful patterns? Or did Jake have the right to argue for the necessity of influence and innovation in the modern world? The worst part is still to come. This was more than a disagreement over taste or fashion. According to sources, the altercation became so intense that ties between the two men's social groups started to erode. Friendships cooled. Quietly, invitations to several pulpits were canceled. And it was startling that these divisions were made apparent in a society where outward appearances frequently matter. Even though things got heated, this confrontation raised an even more important question. What does the disagreement between two of the Black church's most powerful voices mean for the organization's future? This is where the narrative becomes even more dramatic. Because Jake and Morton weren't the only ones affected by this altercation. It extended throughout the nation to movements, ministries, and congregations. The ground beneath two giants always trembles when they crash. Following Bishop T.D. Jake's confrontation with Bishop Paul Morton, that is precisely what transpired. What might have been a private dispute behind closed doors soon became the topic of conversation in the entire church community. The tale couldn't be stopped once it left those walls. Let's start by discussing the congregations. Both men are in charge of flocks that adore, revere, and even worship them. Many of Jake's supporters viewed Morton's criticisms as an unwarranted assault, as though he were casting doubt on the authority of the Potter's house and the international reputation Jake has established. Some defended Jake as a visionary who took the gospel to regions that the Orthodox Church could never reach, and hashtags started trending on social media. They maintained that the church would remain in the past and only speak to itself if people like Jake didn't break down walls. Morton's followers, on the other hand, saw the altercation as evidence that their bishop had the guts to say what many others were too scared to acknowledge. Morton wasn't dragging Jake down in their eyes. He was keeping the line, reminding everyone that pastors should be shepherds, not celebrities, and standing for integrity in the pulpit. They believed Morton's position was unaffected by Jake's confrontation. It simply demonstrated how unsettling truth can be when it contradicts authority. However, the consequences were not limited to congregations. In the Black church, other pastors and leaders started to pick sides, albeit cautiously. Elders are revered, and nobody wanted to be perceived as disrespectful. You could still sense the gap, asserting that the gospel has always adjusted to societal changes. Several people agreed with Jake and praised his ability to introduce Christianity into public settings. Others leaned in Morton's direction, warning that too many churches were sacrificing holiness for publicity in their haste to remain relevant. Then the press arrived. Headlines like Clash of the Bishops, Jake and Morton at odds, and is the megachurch model in trouble? Started appearing in Christian news outlets. It was also taken up by secular media groups, which are often keen to draw attention to conflict inside religious communities. All of a sudden, this was more than church rumors. The future of power, leadership, and faith became a national topic of discussion. The fact that it revealed deep-seated resentments inside the church as a whole was what made the situation even more volatile. Morton's remarks were taken as confirmation by many smaller pastors who frequently feel eclipsed by large ministries. They concurred with his criticism, claiming that well-known pastors frequently embezzle funds from nearby congregations and create irrational expectations. However, pastors who cited Jake as an inspiration retaliated, arguing that in a time when church attendance was dropping and young people were abandoning established institutions, innovation and a global presence were crucial. However, damaged relationships were possibly the most unexpected consequence. Jake and Morton have been spotted together at important gatherings, services, and conferences for years. Together, they represented the church's strength and unity. Invitations subtly vanished after this altercation. Once both names appeared on the same flyer, conferences now only display one name. Behind the scenes, insiders murmured about partnerships that had formerly strengthened the church starting to fall apart, alliances disintegrating, and mutual friends being compelled to take sides. Even celebrities and gospel musicians with ties to both leaders ended up in difficult situations. Do you openly back one, or do you keep quiet and run the risk of coming seen as weak? Silence turned out to be the most secure option for many. However, being quiet simply encouraged further conjecture. Furthermore, although the visible consequences were striking, the inside effects were far more profound. Members of the two leaders' churches started to wonder about the meaning behind the confrontation as much as the actual conflict. Was the Black church on the verge of a fresh civil war between shepherds and celebrities, between innovation and tradition, and between popularity and purity? Rumors started to circulate of phone conversations, private meetings, and attempts at reconciliation that either fell through or were flatly rejected, which only served to escalate the situation. According to several insiders, both men were advised by trusted advisors to minimize the issue before it escalated. However, it was already too late. The narrative took on a life of its own as it became widely known. This is where it becomes even more startling. Morton and Jake were not the only ones impacted by the aftermath. It brought up uneasy issues regarding the megachurch paradigm in general. Is it sustainable for entire ministries to revolve around one man? What happens when that man is gone, or when his leadership is questioned? This was the concern raised by critics. What began as a heated argument between two influential bishops had now grown into something much larger, a turning point for the church itself. These were no longer hypothetical arguments. Rather, they were urgent, real discussions taking place in boardrooms, pulpits, and prayer meetings all over the country. At first glance, it might be easy to dismiss the confrontation between Bishop T. Jakes and Bishop Paul Morton as just another disagreement between two powerful men of God. But the most unexpected twists in this story were yet to come, because while some were preoccupied with the fallout, others were already wondering if this confrontation could change the course of church leadership in America. After all, conflicts between leaders have occurred throughout history, and occasionally they end with time. However, what makes this particular moment so important is that it cuts to the core of what faith leadership looks like in the 21st century, and why it matters not only for the church, but also for society as a whole. It goes far beyond personality, ego, or even church politics. Bishop Paul Morton, who represents an older, more traditional understanding of church leadership, has always emphasized holiness, humility, and the role of pastors as spiritual caretakers first and foremost. He views the pulpit as a sacred space where God's truth must be protected at all costs, rather than a platform for fame. Let's start with the generational divide. Bishop T.D. Jake Jakes, on the other hand, represents the contemporary media-savvy model of church leadership. His ministry has embraced television, film, conferences, and now digital platforms to reach a global audience. This viewpoint is particularly appealing to older generations of believers who grew up in churches where discipline, reverence, and order were the cornerstones of the faith experience. To younger generations and those outside of traditional church circles, Jake stands for accessibility, relevance, and a daring approach to sharing the gospel. His influence extends beyond the pulpit into entertainment, politics, and social justice discussions. He does more than just preach sermons. He creates events that feel larger than life, capable of drawing thousands in person and millions online. The question that arises is, what is the right path for the church moving forward? Do we embrace the tools and platforms of the modern world to stay relevant in an ever-evolving culture, or do we hold tightly to the roots that have sustained generations? The clash between these two leaders is not just personal, it is symbolic of a much larger tension between tradition and innovation. Let's zoom out to the cultural implications. When leaders like Jake and Morton clash, it sends shockwaves through the community because their voices carry weight, not only spiritually, but also culturally. The church in America, especially in the Black community, has always been more than just a place of worship. It has been a place of safety, a hub for social justice, and a place where identity and empowerment are fostered. Think about this. When TD Jake hosts his massive conferences like Woman, Thou Art Loose, or Mega Fest, they are not just spiritual gatherings, they are economic engines that shape how communities organize, respond to challenges, and engage with issues like politics, economics, and racial justice. Then there's the worldwide influence. Jake's ministry extends well beyond the United States. His conferences attract people from all over the world. His books are translated into several languages, and his sermons are broadcast internationally. As a result, his methods set an example for ministries everywhere. Therefore, Morton's confrontation is not just about Jake, it's about sending a warning to the global church. Be careful not to lose your soul in the pursuit of influence. Morton's confrontation also forces us to confront a deeper spiritual question. If the celebrity-driven model becomes the norm, churches in Africa, Europe, and beyond may follow suit. This question affects not only Jake and Morton, but also every pastor, minister, and believer attempting to navigate faith in a contemporary world full of opportunities, temptations, and distractions. What does it mean to be a shepherd? Is a shepherd defined by the size of his flock, the reach of his platform, or the purity of his message? And here's the most potent part. This conflict highlights a universal human struggle. Whether in the workplace, in the church, or in one's personal life, people everywhere struggle to strike a balance between success and authenticity, between humility and ambition, between staying true to one's roots and adjusting to the demands of the present. Because it is fundamentally about the age-old struggle between staying grounded and reaching higher, this confrontation is resonating far beyond the pews. But here's where it gets interesting. Younger pastors and believers who are closely observing are having new conversations about this conflict because many millennials and Gen Z Christians are sick of both extremes. They're asking new questions, looking for new models, and pushing for a balance that honors tradition while embracing innovation. In many ways, the Jake Morton confrontation has become a catalyst for this new generation to rethink what church should look like in their time. They don't want a church that feels out of date and irrelevant, but they're also wary of a church that looks more like Hollywood than holy ground. However, the most important question still remains unresolved in spite of all these wider ramifications. Will the church be able to move forward together, or will this conflict lead to deeper divisions that persist for years? The way this confrontation is handled will undoubtedly set a precedent, and if reconciliation is possible, it could serve as an example of humility, maturity, and true leadership. Although it may appear to be just another church conflict, this moment has significance that goes well beyond the individuals involved. It is a test of leadership, a reflection of cultural changes, and a mirror held up to the church itself. However, if the rift widens, it may indicate a permanent fracture in the way church leaders interact with one another and with their communities. What comes next could alter the course of religion leadership for centuries to come. The world is watching.